In the vast expanse of the Serengeti, where golden grass stretches endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a legend was about to be born. Not from glory, not from natural dominance, but from something far darker. Something that would transform a young lion from a grieving cub into an instrument of vengeance so terrifying that the very name would become whispered across the plains like a curse. This is the story of Kesai, a lion whose journey from loss to devastation would rewrite everything we thought we knew about grief, memory, and the capacity for calculated revenge in the animal kingdom. Before we dive into the darkness that consumed Kesai's heart, you need to understand where it all began. The year was 2019, in the northern reaches of the Serengeti, where water was still abundant, and life thrived in the rhythm that had persisted for thousands of years. Two young male lions, barely into their third year, moved together through this landscape. They were brothers, born just hours apart under the same mother, raised side by side from their first breath. Kesai was the larger of the two, his mane already showing the early hints of darkness that would define him in his prime. His brother, whom the rangers called Simba, was leaner, more agile, but equally formidable. Together they were inseparable, moving as a single organism through the grasslands, hunting as one, resting beneath acacia trees with their bodies pressed against each other. If you love intense wildlife documentaries that reveal the brutal truth of nature, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. What you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild lions. Their bond was not merely instinctual. Guides who tracked them for months noted something unusual in their behavior. These two brothers communicated with soft vocalizations that seemed to transcend simple territorial claims or hunting calls. They possessed an awareness of each other that bordered on telepathic. When one was threatened, the other responded before the danger was fully visible. When one found food, both fed with equal priority. In a species where males are typically solitary and competitive, these two brothers defied every expectation, creating a partnership so tight that some researchers questioned whether they were truly just brothers or something more, bound by a connection deeper than genetics alone. Life in the Serengeti had hardened them both. At barely 3 years old, they had already survived droughts that killed weaker lions, avoided territorial disputes with older males, and learned to hunt prey that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Buffalo, the most dangerous prey on the plains, had fallen to their coordinated tactics. Zebra herds scattered at their approach. Even the hyena clans, normally bold in their aggression, learned to respect the power radiating from these two young males. The Serengeti was teaching them that strength and strategy were the currencies of survival, and both brothers possessed them in abundance. But strength alone doesn't rule the African plains. Territory does, and territory must be defended against all threats, no matter how formidable they might appear. In early September 2019, the brothers encountered the Mara Pride, a coalition of 5 massive males who had held control over the eastern stretches of the Serengeti for nearly 7 years. These were hardened veterans, scarred from countless battles, their manes thick and dark with the weight of authority. When they caught the scent of 2 young intruders moving through their claimed lands, their response was immediate and violent. The confrontation happened near the Mara River at dawn, when mist still clung to the ground and the light was pale and ghostly. The 5 older males emerged from the tall grass in coordinated formation, their roars shaking the earth itself. Kesai and Simba stood their ground, refusing to flee like younger, less confident lions would have done. For 18 minutes, the 6 lions clashed in a whirlwind of teeth and claws, dust rising in clouds that obscured the true horror of what was unfolding. The brothers fought with everything they possessed, but the mathematics of the situation were brutal. 2 against 5, skill against experience, youth against hardened warriors who had forgotten more about combat than the brothers would ever learn. By the time the dust settled, Simba lay motionless on the blood-soaked earth, a deep gash across his throat, his breathing coming in wet, labored gasps that everyone present knew would soon stop entirely. Kesai, bleeding from a dozen wounds, tried desperately to pull his brother away from the advancing males, but he was already surrounded. The Mara Pride had won, and they weren't finished. What happened next would become the crucible in which Kesai's transformation began. As Simba's final breaths rattled from his broken body, the Mara males didn't simply leave their victory on the field. They did what older males do when they eliminate competition. They consumed him. They fed on the body of Kesai's only brother, while Kesai stood perhaps 50 meters away, separated by the sheer dominance of the victors. forced to watch as the only being he had ever truly bonded with was reduced to food for his killers. For 3 hours, Kesai remained motionless, his amber eyes locked on that horrific scene, his body trembling with something that witnesses would later describe as pure psychological anguish. The roars of the Mara pride echoed across the plains like thunder, celebrating their dominance, declaring ownership over every inch of territory these young invaders had dared to cross. When darkness fell, the Mara males finally retreated, their hunger satisfied, their territorial message delivered. They left behind nothing but scattered remains and the ghost of what had been Kesai's entire world. The young lion approached his brother's body slowly, carefully, as if movement itself might shatter what little remained of his sanity. For the rest of that night, he lay pressed against those broken remains, his face buried in what was left, making sounds that no living creature should ever have to make. Not roars, not even whimpers. Something deeper, more primal, a grief so profound that the very air seemed to mourn alongside him. Rangers found Kesai the following morning, still there, still motionless except for the occasional tremor that ran through his body. They maintained a respectful distance, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred and terrible. Dr. Eleanor Masai, a wildlife behavioral specialist who happened to be in the area, documented the scene with notes that would later become crucial to understanding everything that followed. He was catatonic, she wrote. His eyes were open, but he was seeing something that wasn't there. Or perhaps he was seeing something we can never understand. What I witnessed was the moment a young lion ceased to exist and something else was born in his place. Over the following weeks, Kesai seemed to vanish into the Serengeti itself. Rangers caught only glimpses of him, a shadow moving through the tall grass, his ribs showing prominently through his coat, his mane unkempt and matted with dirt. He wasn't hunting, he wasn't claiming territory. He was simply existing in a state of suspended animation, moving because movement was what his body did, breathing because breathing was what bodies did, but nothing inside him was truly alive. The grief had hollowed him out completely, leaving behind only an empty vessel that looked like a lion but was something far different. Weeks turned into months, and something began to shift in that emptiness. Around month 3, rangers noticed that Kesai's behavior was changing. The catatonic wandering stopped. The aimless movement ceased. In its place came something purposeful, something directed, something that frightened even the most experienced guides who had spent decades in the African wilderness. Kesai began to hunt, not for survival, but with an intensity and precision that seemed almost surgical in nature. He killed a buffalo alone, something most lion prides couldn't accomplish. He stalked zebra with a patience that suggested he had all the time in the world. His body began to recover, his ribs disappearing beneath muscle that seemed to grow with each passing day. But most importantly, his eyes changed. Where once there had been a young lion's curiosity, there was now something cold and calculating. Where once there had been the warmth of brotherhood and connection, there was now nothing but a void filled with singular purpose. Kesai had transformed, and those who watched this transformation understood that they were witnessing something that happened rarely in nature. A being forged in pain and shaped by memory into something entirely new. A weapon constructed from grief itself. By month 6 of his solitary existence, Kesai had begun to actively hunt members of the Mara pride, not for food, not for territory, but for vengeance. He tracked them with a precision that suggested he had spent every moment of the past 6 months studying their patterns, learning their movements, understanding their vulnerabilities. He killed the youngest member first, a male who had probably played only a supporting role in Simba's death. He found him separated from the rest of the pride near a watering hole, and struck with such fury that other lions abandoned the location entirely for weeks afterward. The Mara pride noticed. They began to realize that the young lion they had dismissed as insignificant was now something far more dangerous. They started moving in tighter formations. They kept constant watch. They marked their territory more aggressively, their roars carrying across the plains with a desperation that hadn't been there before. But they couldn't have known what was truly coming. None of them could have predicted the transformation that 11 months of isolation and rage had wrought. And as Kesai prepared for what would become the final reckoning, he was no longer the same young lion who had watched his brother die. He was something the Serengeti had never encountered before, a monster born from memory, hardened by loss, and dedicated entirely to a single purpose. The month was August 2020, 11 months after that fateful dawn near the Mara River. Kesai was ready. The hunt for the final vengeance was about to begin. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below because the story you're about to hear will test everything you believe about nature's capacity for darkness. By the time August 2020 arrived, Kesai had become a phantom that haunted the Serengeti. The young lions who had once played and hunted alongside him were gone, replaced by a creature that seemed to operate on a frequency that no other predator could comprehend. His physical transformation was staggering. What had once been a lean, athletic young male was now a mass of rippling muscle and controlled fury. His mane, which had shown only hints of darkness 11 months earlier, now hung thick and black, almost purple in certain light, adorned with scars that told the story of every battle, every kill, every moment of his singular obsession. Rangers who encountered him described an almost supernatural presence, as if the very air around him crackled with barely contained violence. The Mara pride had grown increasingly paranoid. 5 had become 4 after Kesai's first calculated kill. Then 4 became 3 when he isolated another member during a moment of weakness near a dried riverbed. The remaining males knew they were being hunted, but hunting by nature is a predictable endeavor. This was something different. This was persecution. This was the systematic elimination of rivals, not for territory or resources, but for the simple fact that they had dared to take something irreplaceable from a brother who had loved them more than he had loved life itself. What made Kesai's campaign truly terrifying was his patience. A normal lion seeking vengeance or territory might launch direct attacks, might engage in spectacular battles that ended in quick victory or defeat. Kesai did no such thing. Instead, he operated from the shadows, studying each member of the Mara pride with the intensity of a chess master analyzing an opponent across a board. He learned their habits, he understood their individual strengths and weaknesses, he predicted their movements with an accuracy that suggested he could read their minds. And then, when the moment was precisely right, he struck with a precision that left no room for error. The third member of the Mara pride fell during a particularly brutal night in late August. His name among the guides was Kali, and he had been the most aggressive of all 5 males during Simba's death. Witnesses claimed that it was Kali's initial bite to Simba's throat that had sealed the younger brother's fate. Kesai knew this. Kesai had spent months understanding exactly which male had delivered which blow, which lion had fed first on the body of his brother, which predator had seemed to take the most pleasure in the slaughter. Kali had been marked for a particularly brutal end from the moment Kesai's grief had transformed into cold calculation. The hunt for Kali took 3 days. Kesai tracked him across 20 kilometers of open grassland, through dense thickets where visibility dropped to mere meters, across water channels where the scent grew faint and unreliable. But Kesai never lost the trail. It was as if some supernatural force guided him, as if the memory of his brother's blood cried out from the earth itself, directing Kesai toward his target. When he finally cornered Kali near a rocky outcrop overlooking the Serengeti's most remote regions, the confrontation lasted only 43 seconds. Kesai didn't roar. He didn't announce his presence with the traditional challenges that lions use to establish dominance. He simply appeared, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a creature his size, and he attacked with a ferocity that witnesses described as almost inhuman. Kali, despite his size and experience, barely had time to defend himself. Kesai's attacks were targeted, surgical, designed not just to kill, but to inflict maximum suffering on the creature who had participated in Simba's death. When it was finished, Kali lay broken on the rocky ground, and Kesai stood over him, breathing heavily, his black mane matted with blood that wasn't entirely his own. But he didn't eat. This was crucial to understanding the psychology of what Kesai had become. A normal predator consumes its kill, particularly after expending the energy necessary for such a dramatic hunt. Kesai simply left the body where it lay and disappeared into the night. The message was clear to anyone who understood the language of the African wilderness. This wasn't about hunger. This wasn't about territory. This was about something far darker. This was about making sure that everyone, human and animal alike, understood that Kesai had transformed into something that operated beyond the normal rules of predator and prey. By early September, only 2 members of the original Mara pride remained alive. 2 out of 5, and those 2 remaining males understood with absolute certainty that death was coming for them. They began to move together constantly, never separating, never letting their guard down for even a moment. They attempted to recruit other males, hoping that additional numbers might provide some protection against this unstoppable force that hunted them. But young lions in the Serengeti are inherently suspicious of strangers, and word of Kesai's existence had spread through the predator networks of the region. No one wanted to ally themselves with lions marked for death by a creature as determined and efficient as Kesai had become. On September 15, 2020, exactly 11 months and 4 days after Simba's death, Kesai finally confronted the first of the 2 remaining Mara males. His name was Django, and he had been the oldest of the original 5, the leader, the one who had roared loudest during Simba's final moments. The confrontation happened in the open, under a moon so bright it cast clear shadows across the plains. Kesai approached without any attempt at concealment. He walked directly toward Django with the confidence of an executioner walking to deliver a sentence long predetermined. Django tried to run. The old male, despite his experience, despite his years of dominance, chose flight over fight when confronted with the sheer inevitability of death in the form of Kesai. But 11 months of hunting, of building muscle, of refining technique had transformed Kesai into something faster than any lion should be. He caught Django within seconds, pulled him down with a violence that seemed to defy physics itself, and delivered a kill that Dr. Masai, watching from a safe distance with her research team, described in her notes as the most efficient lion kill she had witnessed in 30 years of field research. When morning came, only one remained, the last of the 5 males who had feasted on Simba's body. The youngest, barely older than Kesai himself, a lion named Rafiki who rangers believed had played only a peripheral role in the original slaughter. But Kesai didn't care about degrees of guilt. Kesai cared only about completion, about finishing what had been begun 11 months ago when his entire world had been torn away in 18 minutes of blood and chaos. Rafiki was intelligent, more intelligent than his companions perhaps, because he understood that hiding was no longer an option. Instead, he made a choice that demonstrated a kind of courage, or perhaps simply an acceptance of inevitable fate. He stopped running, he stopped moving, he positioned himself on elevated ground near the Mara River, the exact location where Simba had fallen, and he waited. The confrontation between Kesai and Rafiki would become the stuff of legend among the guides and rangers of the Serengeti. They would tell the story around evening fires for decades, speaking of the 2 lions who met under circumstances that seemed almost scripted, as if some force beyond nature itself had orchestrated this final meeting. Kesai approached slowly, deliberately, giving Rafiki every opportunity to fight, to flee, to do anything except simply stand there waiting for death. But Rafiki didn't move. As Kesai drew closer, some observers claimed to see something extraordinary, not in Rafiki's face, but in his posture. Not defiance or aggression, but something that looked almost like acceptance. As if in some way that transcended species and communication, Rafiki understood that he was part of something larger than himself, that he was a piece in a story that had been written in blood and memory and grief. The final battle lasted 19 seconds. Kesai destroyed Rafiki with a precision and power that left no doubt about the outcome before it even began. And when it was finished, when all 5 members of the Mara Pride had been systematically hunted down and eliminated, Kesai stood in the middle of the Serengeti and released a roar that witnesses claimed could be heard for 20 kilometers in all directions. It wasn't a roar of triumph. It wasn't a roar of territorial dominance or sexual prowess. It was the roar of a being who had been hollowed out by grief and filled with vengeance, and who had finally seen that vengeance complete. But completion of the hunt didn't mean completion of Kesai's transformation. If anything, it accelerated it. With his singular purpose achieved, something else began to emerge from the darkness that had consumed him for 11 months. Rage, pure, undirected, all-consuming rage that had no specific target anymore. The Mara Pride was gone, eliminated entirely. The vengeance had been served, but the void inside Kesai, the hole where his brother had been, remained empty, and into that emptiness poured something that the Serengeti had rarely seen before. A predator so violent, so indiscriminate in his aggression, that every other creature on the plains began to reorganize their entire existence around the simple fact of his existence. Kesai began to kill everything. Not for food, though he would occasionally feed on his kills. Not for territory, though he would claim vast stretches of land through his mere presence, but simply because the act of killing seemed to be the only thing that provided any relief from the emptiness inside him. Hyena packs that numbered in the dozens would scatter at his approach. Cape buffalo, among the most dangerous prey on the African plains, would flee at the sound of his roar. Even other lions, creatures he might have reasonably expected to contest him for territory, would abandon their chosen lands rather than risk an encounter with this black-maned force of nature. The psychological impact on the Serengeti was profound. Animals that had evolved over millions of years to handle the normal predatory pressures of the African wilderness suddenly found themselves facing something that didn't operate according to any evolutionary rule they understood. Prey animals began to behave erratically. Territorial boundaries shifted. The entire ecosystem seemed to warp around the presence of this single creature. Dr. Masai documented everything, filling journal after journal with observations that suggested she was witnessing the birth of something genuinely new, a predator that had evolved beyond simple predatory behavior into something almost supernatural. By October 2020, rangers had begun to refer to Kesai by a different name. No longer just the name that meant spear or warrior in the local language. Now they called him Kifo, which meant death, and the name fit perfectly. Wherever Kesai walked, death followed. Not just death of predators, not just death of normal prey, but a kind of ecological death that affected everything in his vicinity. The very presence of Kifo seemed to drain the land of its vitality, of its life force, of anything resembling the natural balance that the Serengeti had maintained for thousands of years. Some rangers began to whisper that they had created a monster, that in allowing Kesai to survive, in documenting his journey from grieving cub to unstoppable force of nature, they had somehow enabled the birth of something that the African wilderness was not equipped to handle. Others argued that Kesai, now known throughout the region as Kifo, represented something that had always been possible in nature, that grief and memory and intelligence had always had the potential to transform a being into something that transcended normal predatory behavior, that Kifo was not an anomaly, but rather a revelation of what nature had always been capable of creating when circumstances aligned in precisely the right way. What no one could deny was that the Serengeti had changed. The balance of power, which had remained relatively constant for millennia, had shifted dramatically. A single lion, a creature born from the union of grief and vengeance and isolation, had fundamentally altered the ecosystem around him, and the consequences of that alteration were still unfolding, still spreading, still reshaping the world in ways that no one could have predicted when a young cub had watched his brother die 11 months earlier. By late October 2020, the legend of Kifo had spread far beyond the boundaries of the Serengeti itself. Wildlife researchers across East Africa were publishing papers, sharing field notes, and conducting heated debates about the psychological and behavioral phenomenon that seemed to be manifesting in this single black-maned lion. Universities offered courses analyzing the case. Conservation groups organized emergency meetings. International wildlife organizations sent teams to study this creature that seemed to defy every established principle of animal behavior that had been carefully documented over centuries of observation. But Kifo cared nothing for the attention he was receiving. He moved through the landscape like a force of nature, indifferent to the cameras that followed him, unconcerned with the researchers who documented his every movement, disconnected entirely from the human world that had begun to orbit around his existence. His focus remained singular and unwavering. The void inside him, the space where his brother had been, remained empty no matter how many creatures he killed, no matter how much blood he spilled, no matter how completely he dominated every inch of territory he claimed. What made Kifo truly terrifying, however, wasn't simply his capacity for violence. It was his intelligence. Rangers and researchers began to document behaviors that suggested Kifo was engaging in something that looked disturbingly like tactical warfare. He would drive prey towards specific locations, using geographical features and wind patterns in ways that suggested sophisticated planning. He would test the defenses of other predators, learning their strengths and weaknesses before engaging in actual conflict. He would manipulate water sources, understanding that controlling access to water meant controlling life and death across vast territories. One particularly chilling incident involved a coalition of 3 young male lions who had attempted to claim territory within Kifo's growing domain. The 3 males, each formidable in their own right, had sought to establish themselves as a new force in the region. Kifo's response was methodical and devastating. Rather than engaging them directly, he began a campaign of psychological warfare. He would appear at the edges of their territory and release roars that seemed to carry a weight that normal lion vocalizations never possessed. He would mark their hunting grounds, leaving scent signatures that declared ownership in a way that no other lion dared to challenge. The 3 young males began to fracture almost immediately. The psychological pressure that Kifo was applying seemed to undermine their cohesion in ways that physical confrontation might never have accomplished. Within 2 weeks, one male had abandoned the territory entirely, fleeing to regions far beyond Kifo's claimed domain. The remaining two attempted a direct confrontation, and the resulting battle lasted less than 4 minutes. Both males survived, but barely, and both understood with absolute certainty that remaining in Kifo's territory meant death. They left, limping and broken, carrying with them stories of an encounter with something that transcended normal lion behavior. What fascinated the researchers most was Kifo's apparent understanding of cause and effect, his ability to predict outcomes and plan accordingly. Dr. Masai documented an incident in which Kifo deliberately allowed a potential rival to escape from an initial confrontation, seemingly understanding that a wounded, traumatized lion fleeing from his territory would serve as a more effective deterrent to other potential challenges than an outright kill would have provided. This suggested a level of psychological sophistication that most wildlife experts had assumed was exclusive to humans. By November 2020, the transformation that had begun with Simba's death had reached its apex. Kifo was no longer simply a lion. He had become a monarch of death, a being that ruled through the sheer force of his will and the terror that his existence inspired. Other predators avoided him entirely. Hyena packs that once might have challenged a lone lion now fled at the mere suggestion of his presence. Leopards, typically solitary and confident in their ability to navigate the African wilderness, began to shift their hunting patterns to avoid any possibility of encounter. But the most profound change was in Kifo himself. Observers noted that his behavior had begun to shift in subtle but significant ways. The aggressive hunting that had characterized his early months of isolated existence had evolved into something more measured, more deliberate. He began to spend long periods simply standing in elevated locations, staring out across the landscape with an expression that some researchers described as melancholic. His eating habits changed. He consumed less, seemed less interested in the act of feeding, as if sustenance had become merely a mechanical necessity rather than something that provided any genuine satisfaction. The emptiness that had driven him for 11 months seemed to be evolving into something different. Not quite fulfillment, because nothing could truly fill the void left by Simba's death, but something closer to resignation, an understanding that vengeance, while complete, had not done what he had perhaps unconsciously hoped it would do. It had not brought his brother back. It had not restored what had been lost. It had only created more death, more suffering, more blood soaking into the Serengeti's soil. In December 2020, something unprecedented occurred. Kifo, the unstoppable force of nature that had terrified every predator across the region, allowed a young female lion to share a kill with him, not aggressively, not as a dominance display, but almost as if he had simply tolerated her presence without the violent rejection that any other being in his territory might have expected. The researchers watching this interaction felt their breath catch. This was the first sign that Kifo's isolation might be beginning to fracture, that the singular focus that had driven him for over a year might finally be shifting. Over the following weeks, this female, named Zara by the rangers, began to spend increasing amounts of time in Kifo's presence. She maintained a respectful distance, never challenging his dominance, never attempting to claim territory as her own. She simply existed alongside him, and Kifo, in his way, seemed to tolerate this companionship. It was a strange pairing. The female lion was relatively young, healthy, and carried none of the psychological weight that burdened Kifo, yet somehow her presence seemed to provide something that no amount of killing or territorial dominance had been able to offer: a connection, a break from the absolute isolation that had defined his existence for over a year. By January 2021, Zara had become a permanent fixture in Kifo's life. They hunted together, though Kifo still did most of the actual killing. They rested side by side in the shade during the heat of the day. They moved through the territory as a pair, and somehow the very presence of another being seemed to soften Kifo's edges, to make him marginally less of a force of pure destruction and marginally more of an actual lion. The researchers noted this transformation with fascination and a sense of tentative hope. Perhaps, they theorized, companionship might provide what vengeance could not. Perhaps the presence of another being, particularly one that didn't challenge his dominance but simply accepted his existence, might provide some measure of healing to the psychological wounds that had driven Kifo's rampage across the Serengeti. But the universe has a way of punishing hope, of demonstrating that redemption is never as simple as we might hope it to be. In late January 2021, a coalition of exiled males, desperate and hungry, made the mistake of venturing into Kifo's territory. They were young, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, and they had been driven from their original pride by older, more dominant males. They were looking for new territory, a place where they might establish themselves and begin building a new pride. What happened next would become the most violent encounter ever documented in Kifo's reign. The young males, numbering 5 in total, attempted to claim land that Kifo had marked as his own. Kifo's response was immediate and absolute. But this time, something was different. This time, Zara fought alongside him. The partnership that had begun to form between these two lions transformed into something almost military in its coordination. Zara attacked from angles that seemed designed to give Kifo clear access to vulnerable targets. Kifo moved with a precision that seemed almost choreographed, driving one male toward Zara, then turning to engage another while she dealt with her target. The battle lasted 32 minutes, and when it was finished, only 2 of the 5 invaders were still alive, and both of those were so badly wounded that they could barely walk. The other 3 lay scattered across the blood-stained grass, their bodies broken beyond recognition. Kifo stood in the center of this carnage, breathing heavily, his black mane matted with blood and dust. And next to him stood Zara, equally bloodied, equally exhausted, equally transformed by the violence they had just unleashed together. What happened after the battle was crucial to understanding the final transformation of Kifo. Rather than allowing his rage to consume him further, rather than pursuing the fleeing males to ensure their deaths, Kifo simply turned away. He walked slowly toward a nearby acacia tree, and Zara followed. They lay down together in the shade, their bodies touching, their breathing gradually slowing from the frantic pace of combat to something more normal. For the first time since Simba's death, Kifo seemed to find a moment of peace. The researchers documenting this incident understood that they were witnessing a turning point. Kifo's journey from grieving cub to instrument of vengeance to monarch of death was entering a new phase. The rage that had driven him seemed to be finding an outlet, not in the indiscriminate killing of everything in his path, but in the defense of something concrete, a territory, a companion, a life that was beginning to mean something again. By February 2021, 15 months after Simba's death, the landscape of the Serengeti had stabilized around Kifo's presence. Yes, he remained a force to be reckoned with, a predator whose reputation continued to inspire fear and respect throughout the region. But he was no longer a force of pure destruction. He had become a protector, a territorial guardian, something that more closely resembled a normal lion, albeit one that was significantly more powerful and significantly more deadly than any other creature in the region. Dr. Masai published her preliminary findings in a prestigious wildlife research journal, concluding that Kifo represented a case study in the power of grief to transform behavior and the capacity of companionship to redirect that grief towards something more productive than pure vengeance. Her paper became required reading in universities across the globe, discussed in conservation programs, cited in behavioral psychology courses as evidence that animals possessed far more psychological complexity than had previously been believed. But the full story of Kifo, the complete arc of his transformation, was far from over, because in the African wilderness nothing remains static. Everything exists in constant flux, constantly being challenged, constantly being tested, and Kifo, despite the companionship of Zara, despite the establishment of his dominion across a vast territory, still carried within him the weight of his brother's death. That weight would never truly disappear. It would only evolve, transform, find new outlets, new expressions, new ways of manifesting itself in the actions of a lion that had been fundamentally altered by loss. As the dry season began to approach and the Serengeti entered that time of year when resources became scarce and tensions ran high, everyone who understood the landscape of predator politics understood one simple truth. Kifo remained out there, watching, waiting, ready to defend what was his and to remember, always, what had been taken from him. The question that no one could answer was simple but profound. Had Kifo truly begun to heal, or was he simply dormant, waiting for the next challenge, the next threat, ready to transform again into the unstoppable force of nature that had earned him the name that meant death? The dry season of 2021 arrived with the intensity that only the African wilderness could deliver. Rain vanished from the landscape as if it had never existed at all. The grasslands, once lush and green, transformed into brittle, golden expanses that crackled beneath the paws of predators and prey alike. Water became the most precious commodity on the plains, and the few remaining waterholes transformed into flashpoints of tension, where every species that depended on survival understood that conflicts would inevitably emerge. It was under these circumstances that the true test of Kifo's transformation would come. not in battle against rival lions or territorial disputes with other predators, but in something far more fundamental, the presence of a new threat. A threat that would force Kifo to choose between the path of redemption he had begun to walk with Zara, or a return to the absolute darkness that had consumed him in the months following Simba's death. The threat came in the form of a massive male lion from outside the territory. His name was unknown to the rangers and researchers, but he carried himself with the confidence of a creature that had never truly been defeated. He was older than Kifo, perhaps 10 years to Kifo's 5, but age had not diminished his power. His mane was enormous, almost grotesquely large, and his body carried the scars of 100 battles. He had been driven from his original territory by younger, stronger males, and now he was searching for a new domain that he could claim as his own. The first encounter between Kifo and this stranger occurred at the Mara River in late June, at a waterhole that had become particularly important to Kifo's territory. The older male approached without attempting to conceal his presence. He drank from the waterhole while Kifo watched from a distance, and when he was finished, he marked the territory with scent that was so powerful and so deliberate that it seemed almost like a declaration of war. Kifo's response was measured. He approached the older male carefully, understanding that this was not simply another young, desperate lion seeking to challenge his authority. This was a seasoned predator, someone who had survived decades in the African wilderness through a combination of skill, experience, and ruthlessness. The two lions stared at each other across the waterhole, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were both creatures shaped by violence, both beings that had been forged in the fires of conflict and survival. The older male roared, and the sound carried an authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Kifo roared in return, and his roar carried something that no other lion in the region could match. It carried the weight of vengeance completed, the burden of grief that had never fully lifted, the absolute confidence of a creature that had never truly been defeated in genuine combat. The two roars met in the air between them, and for a moment the entire Serengeti seemed to hold its breath. The fight did not happen that day. Instead, the older male withdrew, moving back into the buffer territory that surrounded Kifo's core domain. But everyone understood that this was not a withdrawal born from fear or respect. This was a tactical retreat, a moment in which the older male was assessing his opponent, determining whether direct confrontation was worth the risk it would entail. Over the following weeks, the tension between Kifo and the stranger escalated. The older male would probe the boundaries of Kifo's territory, testing his responses, pushing into increasingly central areas, clearly working toward a confrontation that seemed inevitable. Zara became nervous during this period. She understood, through instincts older than language itself, that something fundamental was about to occur. She stayed closer to Kifo, never leaving his side, as if her presence might somehow protect him, or perhaps simply provide companionship during what she seemed to anticipate would be a trial of extraordinary magnitude. By mid-July, the older male had become brazenly aggressive. He began to actively challenge Kifo's territorial claims, making kills within Kifo's domain, marking trees that Kifo had already marked, even approaching the den where Zara preferred to rest during the heat of the day. The message was clear and unmistakable. The stranger was not asking for permission to share the territory. He was announcing his intention to claim it entirely, to displace Kifo, and to establish his own dominion across the region. What happened next would become the most documented lion confrontation in the history of African wildlife research. Rangers and researchers had positioned themselves across multiple locations with cameras, drones, and recording equipment, understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The final battle between Kifo and the stranger would not be a simple territorial dispute. It would be a confrontation between two entire philosophies of existence, between a creature shaped by grief and vengeance and isolation, and a creature shaped by decades of predatory excellence and ruthless dominance. The confrontation occurred on July 23, 2021, exactly 19 months after Simba's death. The location was the Mara River itself, the same location where the original conflict with the Mara Pride had occurred, the same place where Simba had fallen, and the entire trajectory of Kifo's existence had been fundamentally altered. It seemed almost as if the universe itself had orchestrated the symbolism of the moment. The two males approached each other from opposite banks of the river. The older male moved with the confidence of a creature that had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of combat. Kifo moved with the quiet certainty of a being that had discovered something far darker than simple violence. As they entered the shallow water, the confrontation began not with an explosive charge, but with a measured circling, each male assessing the other, testing responses, looking for weaknesses. When the actual combat erupted, it was immediate and violent. The older male attacked with techniques honed across decades of territorial battles. He was powerful, experienced, and clearly had defeated many challengers in his time. But Kifo fought with something that transcended technique or experience. He fought with the absolute certainty that nothing in his life mattered except this moment. Every movement was precise. Every strike was calculated to inflict maximum damage. Every defense was positioned to prevent his opponent from gaining any advantage. The battle lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of violence so intense that researchers watching through cameras found themselves unable to maintain objectivity, found themselves physically reacting to the brutality they were witnessing. Both lions were bloodied extensively. The older male proved to be more resilient than any opponent Kifo had faced since his transformation. Multiple times during the battle, it seemed as if the older male might actually prevail, might actually succeed in displacing Kifo and claiming the territory as his own. But the older male was exhausted. He was 10 years old in a region where most lions never survived past 15. The years of constant struggle, of territorial defense, of the relentless pressure that came with being an apex predator had taken their toll on his body. Kifo, despite being younger and despite never having engaged in this particular style of territorial combat before his transformation, possessed something that no amount of experience could fully replicate. He possessed absolute focus born from the absolute despair of losing everything that had ever mattered to him. The turning point came in the 38th minute of the battle. The older male, seeking to end the confrontation with a decisive blow, overextended himself. Kifo was waiting for precisely this moment. He pivoted with a speed that seemed impossible for a creature his size, and his teeth found purchase on the older male's throat. It was not an immediate kill. It was the kind of bite that would lead inevitably to death, but only if the combat continued. The older male, understanding with the absolute clarity that only a dying creature possesses, attempted to withdraw. But Kifo did not release him. Instead, he held on, maintaining his grip, driving the older male into the shallow water of the river, forcing him down, holding him under the water's surface, while the older male thrashed desperately, trying with every ounce of remaining strength to break free. When the thrashing finally stopped, when the struggle finally ceased, when the older male's body went limp beneath the surface, Kifo released his grip and stood, breathing heavily, covered in blood, the absolute victor in a battle that had seemed far too evenly matched to conclude with such finality. The researchers documenting the event were stunned into silence. They had witnessed something that transcended normal animal behavior. They had watched as a creature born from grief and shaped by vengeance had defeated a predator that seemed, on every objective measure, to be his superior. The only explanation, they realized, was that Kifo had fought with something that the older male simply could not match. A will to survive born not from instinct, but from a desire to protect something meaningful. A desire to preserve the territory he shared with Zara. A desire to prove that his transformation was genuine, that his journey from instrument of death to protector and companion had been real. When Zara emerged from the surrounding brush after the battle concluded, she approached Kifo cautiously. The two lions touched faces, pressed their bodies against each other, and together they walked away from the waterhole, leaving the older male's body to be claimed by the scavengers that would inevitably arrive. In that moment, something profound seemed to shift in the landscape itself. The Serengeti recognized a new order. Kifo was not simply a predator that had claimed territory through violence. He was a monarch that had earned his throne through a trial of fire and blood, and he would defend it not through indiscriminate killing, but through the focused intensity of a creature that had discovered something worth protecting. In the months that followed, Kifo's behavior underwent a final transformation. The rage that had characterized his existence seemed to settle into something more balanced. He continued to defend his territory with absolute ferocity, but he stopped the indiscriminate killing that had characterized his earlier reign. He hunted when necessary, protected what was his, and spent increasingly more time simply existing with Zara in companionable silence. By December 2021, over 2 years after Simba's death, Zara gave birth to 3 cubs, 2 males and 1 female. As Kifo watched these cubs take their first steps, played with them in the long grass, protected them from every threat in their environment, something seemed to shift fundamentally in the creature that had once been known only as an instrument of death. The void that had been created by Simba's death would never truly disappear, That emptiness would remain a part of Kifo's psychological makeup for the rest of his life, but it had been transformed into something else, not replaced, but integrated into a life that had meaning beyond vengeance. The legend of Kifo spread across the entire African continent. Wildlife researchers published papers examining his behavior, his psychology, his transformation. Conservation groups used his story to educate people about the emotional complexity of wild animals. But to those who knew the true story, who understood what had motivated his actions, Kifo represented something far more profound. He represented the capacity of grief to transform, the power of memory to reshape existence, and the possibility that even the darkest darkness could eventually give way to something approaching light. Kifo lived another 6 years, ruling his territory until age and accumulated injuries finally caught up with him. When he died in 2027, the Serengeti mourned in ways that seemed almost human. Other lions roared their respects. The land itself seemed quieter, more fragile, as if the world had been diminished by the loss of this creature that had taught the African wilderness so much about the nature of love, loss, and transformation. Dr. Eleanor Masai, who had documented Kifo's entire journey from grieving cub to instrument of vengeance to protector and father, wrote the final entry in her research journal on the day that Kifo died. His story will be remembered, she wrote, not as a tale of revenge or violence, but as a testament to the extraordinary capacity of living creatures to endure, to transform, and ultimately, to find meaning and purpose, even in the darkest circumstances. Kifo proved that the African wilderness is capable of producing creatures whose emotional and psychological complexity rivals our own. He proved that memory and love and grief can shape behavior in ways that transcend simple predatory instinct. And most importantly, he proved that even monsters, even creatures born from darkness and shaped by vengeance, can ultimately find redemption through connection with another being. The Serengeti would never see another creature quite like Kifo, the black-maned lion whose roar had once terrified every predator across hundreds of kilometers of landscape, had transformed into something entirely new. A creature that understood loss, that valued companionship, that protected what mattered to him with the same absolute intensity he had once directed toward destruction. His legacy lived on not just in his offspring, who would inherit his genetics and his territory, but in the fundamental way he had changed humanity's understanding of what animals were truly capable of experiencing and expressing. In the end, the story of Kifo was not a story about revenge or death or the capacity for darkness. It was a story about transformation, about the possibility of change even in the face of absolute despair, about the redemptive power of companionship and love. It was a story that would be told and retold around campfires and in academic institutions, a story that would inspire people to look at the creatures of the African wilderness with new respect and new understanding. And somewhere in the Serengeti, in the territory that Kifo had claimed and protected, his cubs continued to live, carrying within them the genes and perhaps even some echo of the consciousness of the creature that had been born from a brother's death, forged in vengeance, and ultimately transformed into something far greater than his origins would have suggested possible. The monster had become a father, the instrument of death had become a protector, and the Serengeti was forever changed by the creature whose roar had once meant destruction, but ultimately came to mean something far more profound and far more beautiful.